Welcome, students, to week 3, where we are going to go a little deeper in our analysis of the impact of globalization, particularly around poverty. Poverty is an issue that is close to the heart of God. We know that there are somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 verses in the Bible that speak about God's concern for the poor. So it's worth taking the time and energy to go a little bit deeper in terms of how globalization impacts the poor. What is very clear is that globalization increases wealth creation. So I want to unpack that a little bit. I want to unpack that going back to some of the narratives that we looked at in week 2. Remember that conquest led to the appropriation and accumulation of value that was used as capital in the Industrial Revolution. And that capital allowed for industrialization, which it created more efficient production, for technology, innovations in production, communication, and transportation, and for increased trade, so expanded markets and foreign investment. All of those, what is often referred to as ITT, but I think of it as CITT since it did start with conquest, all of it does create wealth. Bryant Myers is accurate about that. And the impact of wealth creation is decreased poverty. So let's just look at this very simply for a moment. From 1990 to 2015, we had the percentage of people in the world living on less than $1.25 per day went from 36% to 12%. That's huge. That's a huge impact on poverty that is clearly connected to the wealth creation possible through globalization. China, as the most populous country in the world, was a major part of the shift. So let's look a little bit at what happened in China and how it was related to globalization. So China grew from 1978 to 2005 at a rate of an average of 10% per year. That's amazing, right? I mean, that's incredible. Their formula was different than the Washington Consensus formula, but it had some aspects in common. So they combined government control and free enterprise. They encouraged foreign investment and trade, but it was tightly managed by the government. For example, they maintained an independent currency, so it was not affected by currency shifts around the world, and they never devalued their currency. And they maintained a strong education and healthcare system. So they followed their own path, but the path did, as you can see, involve massive engagement in globalization. So globalization does accelerate wealth creation, and that does reduce poverty, as we've just seen in the example of China. But it also has negative impacts on the poor. To talk about the first set of impacts, I want to share a common saying with you. When the rich catch a cold, the poor get pneumonia. And that's a way of saying that if there are negative impacts on a society as a whole, those negative impacts are often felt most strongly, suffered most strongly by the poorest members of the society. So environmental damage is not an automatic consequence of globalization, but it's often a consequence of economic growth, when economic growth doesn't slow down to ensure that the environment is protected, but rather ignores the consequences to the environment. And of course, that has happened often and around the world, and it has happened in China. where China is famously polluted and a major contributor to global warming. International criminal collaboration. The girls that are taken in the process of global human trafficking are not from wealthy families, and they're usually not even from middle-class families. They're from the families of the poor. And then the phenomenon of technology reducing employment. Technology doesn't reduce employment for the wealthiest and most educated sectors of the society. It replaces the jobs of the poorest members of the society. So again, these are phenomena that affect all of society, but affect the poor most. And now we come to inequality. And the work of Richard Wilkinson and Kate McAllister, really stunning work, proves conclusively that inequality has a number of negative impacts on society as a whole, including less social cohesion, more violence, higher stress, more depression and anxiety, and addiction. But there are circumstances in which there is an additional negative impact to the poor, even beyond the more intense impact of all of these factors. Gustavo Gutierrez, the famous liberation theologian from Peru, says that injustice, oppression, extreme poverty mean dying before your time, dying unnecessarily and unjustly. There are cases in which, through globalization, the pie gets bigger, but the slice of the pie owned or controlled by the poor actually gets smaller. Doesn't just stay neutral while the people on top take the additional wealth that's created, but actually ends up with them having less access to life-supporting goods and services. So you saw that in the chapter that you read from Dying for Growth, right? But what I want to talk to you a little bit about is how we end up in that situation where the poor are actually suffering from inequality. And to do that, I need to remind you what Dr. Myers said about some countries having a head start. And I want to talk about what that can mean in terms of the ultimate damage to the poor. And I want to do that talking about Guatemala, which is a situation that I know very well. I have relatives who are Guatemalan. So I want to take you back to 1899, when Guatemala had just won its independence from Spain, partially with the help of the United States, and when the United Fruit Company was created to export agriculture from Guatemala to the United States and other countries. So the government gave United Fruit large land concessions. They gave them control over large portions of land, where they set up agribusiness. They set up a much more efficient method of producing agricultural goods, and that created so much wealth that they were able to buy the railroad system and the telegraph system, so communication and transportation. They were known for paying what we call malnutrition wages, which says that they paid so little to the workers that the workers were malnourished and their children were malnourished. But, paying so little enabled them to create even more wealth. Although they took most of the wealth out of the country, they also gave some of that wealth to the upper class in Guatemala, so they became wealthier as a result. Well, in the early 1950s, a new democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, decided to push back against the power of United Fruit, partly because of the wealth that they were taking out of the country, which the upper class wanted more of for itself, but partly for its treatment of the workers. So he instituted a couple of policies. He made union organizing legal, and he also developed alternative public infrastructure for communication and transportation. And United Fruit was not happy with that, but they lived with that until he brought a proposal to the Guatemalan government to take the lands back that had been granted in exchange, not just take them without any exchange, take them in exchange for the amount of money that United Fruit had valued their lands at the year before for taxation purposes. So United Fruit had said that their land and their business was worth a little bit over $1 million. And so the Guatemalan government was going to pay them $1 million to turn the land back over to Guatemala. They said that they wanted instead $19 million. The Guatemalan government said no. Well, John Foster Dulles was the Secretary of State for President Eisenhower. He had also been the chief lawyer for United Fruit. His brother, Alan Dulles, was the head of the CIA. And through the influence of the Dulles brothers, the U.S. decided to support and equip and participate in a coup by Colonel Castillo Armas, which deposed forcibly the democratically elected president of Guatemala. Well, the new government was not accountable to the people. They were accountable only to United Fruit and to the American government secondarily. So part of their reward for the coup was that they got major loans from the International Monetary Fund, which was controlled by the United States at that time. But because they were not accountable to the people, they spent those loans on their own luxury and the luxury of their cronies. But of course, it was the country of Guatemala that had to pay back the loans. And that's how you end up with the situation that you read about in Dying for Growth, where to pay back the loans, the government is required by the International Monetary Fund to introduce austerity measures, which means cutting back on health and social services. So you end up with a situation where poor people are actually worse off because of globalization. So there's much more that we could say, but this is just a way of helping you to understand the impacts of globalization on poverty, positive and negative. Now the other video this week, this is video number 1. Video number 2, I'm going to give you a biblical perspective on inequality. I was going to wait till the second half of the quarter where we're going to focus on the response of the church, but I thought that maybe it's helpful for you to have that now so that you can think about it. Thank you.